Ghost in the Hull by Steven Bellinger. To my 2 children, Oliver and Caden. Everything I do is to build a better world for you, to show you what it means to stand firmly in the light, and to prove that the dark corners of our lives do not get the final say. You are my greatest victories. This book was not written for fame, profit, or praise. It was written out of a quiet, unyielding desperation to hand a lifeline to anyone currently trapped in the dark. For more than 10 years, I locked the wreckage of my history inside an absolute iron vault, believing that silence was the only way to protect my life ashore. I was wrong. The echoes of trauma eventually catch up to the silence, and carrying that massive, suffocating weight alone is a burden no human being was ever meant to endure. If you are currently hurting, if you are struggling beneath the pressure of your own mind, or if you are dealing with a situation you don't know how to fix, please know that your boundaries matter, your manhood or womanhood is intact, and it is always okay to ask for help. The sole goal of these pages is to prove that you are not alone, that the machine does not own your identity, and that it is entirely possible to survive the breakdown, ask for help, and finally find the surface. Chapter 1. The Misfit. If you looked at my high school transcripts from my freshman and sophomore years at Lake Fenton High School, you would have seen the digital autopsy of a kid who was entirely checked out. School and I never had an understanding. While the other kids sat in rows under the monotonous buzzing hum of fluorescent lights, filling out worksheets, stacking up extra credit assignments, and obsessively tracking their GPA points, I was usually somewhere else entirely. I didn't just struggle with the curriculum, I flat out refused to show up. Most days, a friend and I would slip out of the school parking lot before the first hour had even started. We'd pile into an old car, drive to someone's empty house, pull the blinds shut, and disappear into video games while the rest of our classmates sat in algebra and chemistry. I can still remember the guilty feeling that always lingered in the back of my mind during those afternoons. The knowledge that every hour spent holding a controller was another hour I was falling behind. But avoiding school felt easier than walking into a classroom where I already believed I had failed. Every bad grade, every missed assignment, every disappointed look from a teacher reinforced the same message in my head. You don't belong here. But I managed to slide into class just enough during that chaotic sophomore year to make one permanent, life-altering connection. I met the girl who would eventually become my wife. Amidst all the deliberate skipping, the red-inked bad grades, and the total spiraling lack of focus, she was the one steady anchor in the universe I actually cared about keeping. By the time my junior year rolled around, a cold, heavy reality started to settle deep into my chest. The clock was ticking, loud and clear. I was staring straight down the barrel of adulthood with a completely empty transcript, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I stayed on the path I was on, the world was going to leave me behind in the dirt. I didn't need a standard adjustment. I needed a radical, high-velocity course correction. I walked away from the locked hallways of Lake Fenton High and moved down the street to Southern Lakes Academy, an alternative school. For lack of a better term, Southern Lakes was a beautiful, chaotic haven for misfits. The building was a collection of kids the traditional system simply didn't know what to do with. The rebels, the chronic dropouts, the kids carrying baggage far too heavy for their teenage shoulders. I was a misfit myself, but the exact moment my boots cleared those doors, something profound clicked inside my psychological framework. I discovered a competitive survivalist gear I didn't even know I possessed. I was suddenly overtaken by a quiet, desperate, and terrifying drive. Because of my wasted underclassmen years, I was buried under a mountain of academic debt. To earn my diploma, I had to jam 4 full years of high school requirements into a single, high-speed, 2-year academic sprint. I put my head down and ran until my lungs burned. I spent every single waking hour digging my way out of the academic hole I'd spent years throwing myself into. I dragged my grades up by pure brute force, learned how to lock out distractions, and flat out refused to let myself fail. Yet, even though I was a full-time student at the alternative academy, I refused to completely sever the roots of who I was. Lake Fenton maintained a sports program that allowed me to put on their official jersey. So every afternoon, I'd transition instantly from the outcast classrooms of Southern Lakes back to the high-intensity athletic fields of my original high school. I was living a bizarre dual life, part academic outcast, part varsity athlete, completely driven by the frantic knowledge that I had to build a bridge to a viable future. But as graduation rushed toward me, I knew that bridge wasn't going to lead to a university lecture hall. College wasn't for me. I didn't have the money, I didn't have the patience, and the historic 2008 financial crisis was actively tearing the civilian job market to absolute pieces right outside our front doors. I needed a bigger map, a harder challenge, and a guarantee. My first survival instinct was to join the United States Marine Corps. I signed the official papers for the infantry and was placed directly into the Delayed Entry Program, DEP. Shortly after the ink dried, they packed a group of us poolies into a cold transport bus and shipped us up to a mini boot camp, hidden deep in the freezing, unforgiving woods of Grayling, Michigan. That weekend in Grayling was a visceral wake-up call that hit my system like a bucket of ice water. Marines are a fundamentally different, terrifying breed of human beings. The environment wasn't just strict. It was an unceasing, screaming wall of psychological hyper-intensity that traveled straight past basic military discipline and landed in pure, unadulterated aggression. From the very second the recruiters started yelling, their veins popping out of their necks, their faces inches from mine, I felt a deep, instinctive, and total rejection of the entire culture. It did not vibe with my soul. The people, the frantic energy, the relentless, grinding friction of the aggression, it just didn't click with who I fundamentally was. As I sat on the edge of a cold steel rack in the drafty barracks at Grayling, watching the poolies around me actively thrive on the structural chaos, a sickening realization hit me. I had made a massive, life-altering mistake. I didn't want to be a grunt freezing in the dirt. I wanted out. But the United States Marine Corps does not exactly make it easy for an 18-year-old kid to change his mind. When I traveled back to the local recruitment office and told them flatly that I wanted to drop my infantry contract and switch my enlistment to the Navy, the recruiters instantly threw up a massive, terrifying bureaucratic wall. They threatened me with legal action, lied directly to my face about my structural options, and completely refused to process my release paperwork. They had a rigid monthly quota to fill, and they weren't about to let a healthy infantry body walk out the door without a fight. They assumed an 18-year-old kid from a small Michigan town would simply cave under the raw pressure of their dress blues and heavy chevrons. They completely underestimated how stubborn a misfit from Southern Lakes Academy could be when cornered. I went home, sat down at my desk, and did something completely crazy for an 18-year-old kid with zero political leverage. I wrote a formal, detailed letter to my United States Senator. I laid out the tactical situation plainly, without fluff. I told the senator that I was effectively being held hostage in a delayed entry program, that I possessed a deep, genuine desire to serve my country, but that I explicitly wanted to serve my tenure in the United States Navy. A few weeks later, I walked back into that Marine recruiting station. The physical atmosphere in the room had completely shifted. The toxic, screaming bravado was entirely gone, replaced by a tense, furious, and silent compliance. The commanding officer looked across the desk at me, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth would crack. Word had just descended like a lightning bolt from the very top of the chain of command. "You wrote the senator?" he asked, his voice dripping with pure, incredulous venom. I didn't blink. I just looked him dead in the eye. They realized right then that I wasn't bluffing, and they realized I wasn't going to break under their threats. Grudgingly, with furious strokes of his pen, he signed the official release forms and let me walk out the door. I was officially free. The Navy recruiter across the hall was waiting for me with open arms and a wide grin. I had already taken my official ASVAB test and pulled a 60. In the grand scheme of military testing, a 60 isn't a genius-level score. It wasn't going to get me into the elite nuclear propulsion pathway, but it was solid, technical, and high enough to unlock a lot of highly specialized doors. And I already knew exactly which door I wanted to walk through. My future wife's brother-in-law, Matt, was a seasoned veteran of the submarine force. He was a man I respected immensely, someone who carried himself with a quiet, professional, and unshakable confidence that stood in stark, beautiful contrast to the screaming, uncontrolled chaos I had witnessed in the woods of Grayling. Whenever Matt spoke about his time in the silent service, his eyes would light up in the dark. He talked about the unbreakable camaraderie of the small crews, the absolute technical precision required to survive, and the unique pride of operating completely undetected beneath the waves. Listening to his stories, I knew that was my tribe. The submarine fleet was where the smart-driven misfits went to completely disappear from the face of the earth. To sweeten the deal, the Navy was fighting the intense recruitment crisis of the 2008 recession by throwing massive piles of cash at technical submarine rates. They offered me an official enlistment bonus of exactly $7,000 to sign my life over to the boats. To a kid sitting in a collapsing Michigan economy with absolutely $0 to his name, $7,000 sounded like an absolute unimaginable fortune. It was the final, undeniable validation of the bureaucratic war I had just fought to leave the Marine Corps behind. It was a physical sign that my gut instincts were right. The paperwork was processed, the signatures were locked into the federal database, and the countdown clock hit 0. In January of 2009, with the brutal Michigan winter howling and spitting ice outside the windows, I left Lake Fenton and Southern Lakes Academy in my rearview mirror and headed out for boot camp. I was 18 years old, armed with a $7,000 bonus check, a ticket to the elite submarine fleet, and a crisp, brand new uniform. Chapter 2: The Breaking Point. Boot camp for the United States Navy wasn't the cinematic, impossible nightmare you see in Hollywood movies, but it wasn't a vacation either. For the most part, Great Lakes, Illinois, was exactly what you expected when you signed the papers: a grueling, highly choreographed routine designed to strip away your civilian identity. We woke up early, got beat up with daily physical training until our muscles burned, and spent hours sitting in sterile classrooms learning the basics of naval protocol. I took the hits, followed the orders, and blended into the background. Coming from a stable, middle-class upbringing in Michigan, where my parents had worked hard to ensure I had everything I realistically wanted, the environment was a shock, but it was manageable. Until the day I opened my mouth in the wrong place. We were lined up in a strict silent formation inside the compartment when I made the mistake of whispering a few idle words to another recruit. In the civilian world, it was nothing. In the military, it was an operational security violation in miniature. The recruit division commander, RDC, caught the movement of my jaw, and in a fraction of a second, the entire room erupted. I was marched directly into the center of the concrete barracks floor. I was going to be the day's example. The punishment wasn't a standard set of push-ups. The instructor ordered me into an air chair, a static, wall-less squat where your thighs are parallel to the deck, holding the entire weight of your torso up by pure quad strength, while simultaneously extending my arms straight out to the sides to perform continuous small arm circles. "If you drop your arms, sailor, your entire division drops with you," the RDC bellowed, his voice echoing off the metallic lockers. "You quit, they suffer." I nodded, locked my eyes on a blank point on the distant wall, and started rotating my hands. For the first few minutes, it was just an exercise. Then, the lactic acid began to build. The muscles in my thighs started to vibrate, a slow, deep heat spreading through my legs. But it was my shoulders that caught fire first. I can't tell you how long I stood in that phantom chair. Time stops when you are being broken down in public. Minutes stretched into what felt like an absolute eternity. Every single rotation of my arms began to feel like someone had packed glass shards inside my shoulder blades, digging deeper and deeper into the muscle tissue with every microscopic movement. My lungs screamed for oxygen. My knees shook. The temptation to collapse forward onto the floor was a physical weight pushing down on my neck. But I refused to drop my hands. I looked at the guys in my division standing around the perimeter of the room. They were my teammates. I knew that if my arms gave out, the instructor would drop all of them onto the deck to pay for my weakness. I fundamentally refused to be that guy. I gave every last desperate ounce of physical and mental energy I possessed to that empty space in the air. Eventually, the human machine simply runs out of fuel. My body collapsed, my arms dropping to my sides as I hit the deck, completely spent and gasping for air. The RDC didn't scream. Instead, he immediately transitioned the rest of the division onto the deck, ordering everyone, including me, into a relentless set of crunches. As I lay there on the cold floor, pulling my torso up toward my knees over and over, my abdominal muscles cramping, the instructor walked over. He stopped right above me. He leaned down, his voice dropping below the ambient roar of the barracks. "You showed a lot of heart out there, Bellinger. Keep pushing." Those 7 words hit me harder than the physical punishment. In that exact moment, something shifted inside my psychological framework. I needed that breakdown. I needed to be pushed past the boundary of what I thought I could endure, and I needed to know that when the tank was completely empty, I wouldn't quit on the people next to me. Hearing that instructor validate my effort didn't just give me the strength to finish boot camp. It validated the entire trajectory of my choice to join the military. I was no longer the kid who skipped class at Lake Fenton. I was a sailor who could hold up a division. With Great Lakes behind me, the Navy packed me off to Sonar A School in Groton, Connecticut. If boot camp was about breaking the civilian, Groton was about building the technician. I absolutely loved my time in Connecticut. The base sat along the Thames River, crisp and cold, and the community of prospective submariners was tight-knit. It was there that I met a solid group of friends, guys who shared my exact blend of hyper-focused discipline and low-key nerd culture. We bonded over video games, late-night study sessions, and the shared anxiety of our upcoming fleet assignments. Many of those same guys would end up tracking right alongside me, following me across the country to our eventual home port. Our lead instructor was an STS-2 named Gomez. Gomez was a super cool, laid-back dude who understood exactly how to communicate with a room full of young tech misfits. He made the classrooms engaging, but to be completely honest, looking back on my career, I don't remember using a single piece of actual acoustic information I learned in Groton. A School wasn't a true operational blueprint. It was just a high-speed bridge, designed to line your brain up for the fleet, weeding out the people who couldn't handle the basic technical concepts, before shipping the survivors off to a boat that desperately needed bodies. As graduation approached, the ultimate choice arrived: fast attack or boomer. The fast attack submarines, SSNs, were the glamour ships of the fleet. They carried a single crew, and their deployments were long, unpredictable, and exciting, 6, 7, sometimes 8 months out at sea. Because they didn't carry strategic nuclear missiles, they were free to pull into exotic ports all over the globe. Single guys fought for fast attack orders so they could hit the Liberty ports in Australia, Japan, and Europe. But I wasn't a single guy anymore. My eyes were fixed entirely on the girl I had met during my sophomore year at Lake Fenton. I knew I was going to marry her, and the thought of vanishing into the Pacific for 8 months at a time, with zero communication, didn't vibe with the life I wanted to build. The ballistic missile submarines, the boomers, SSBNs, operated on a completely different philosophy. A boomer has 2 full crews, the blue and the gold, which rotate the ship on predictable 3 to 4 month deployments. Because our sole mission was strategic deterrence, we didn't pull into fancy ports. We slipped into the dark, hid from the world, and came straight back. It was a grind, but it was predictable. It was a schedule a marriage could survive. I graduated 3rd in my class at Groton, which earned me one of the coveted top picks for orders. The first 2 guys ahead of me chose the fast attack route, leaving the boomer boards wide open for me. My choices were narrowed down to two geographical hubs, Kings Bay, Georgia, or Bangor, Washington. I looked at the board, and for some reason, Georgia just didn't resonate with me. The idea of the deep, swampy southern heat didn't feel right. Washington, with its rugged coastline and massive timber, felt like a real adventure. I pointed to the slot for the Pacific Northwest, and a week later, the official paperwork printed out, Assignment, USS Alabama, SSBN 731, Blue Crew. Port, Bangor, Washington. I was thrilled, terrified, and completely ready for the next chapter. I had won the bureaucratic war with the Marines, survived the concrete floor of Great Lakes, conquered the classrooms of Groton, and secured the exact orders I needed to keep my relationship alive. I was 21 pages into a brand new life, and the wind was completely at my back. Chapter 3. Crossing the Brow. In the brief high-speed window between graduating from Groton and reporting to my first duty station, I officially crossed the most important threshold of my civilian life. I got married. We were incredibly young, moving with the rapid, accelerated velocity that the military seems to force on couples. When you are in the service, the system pushes you to settle down quickly. If you aren't married, the Navy treats your partner like a stranger, leaving them behind on the pier with no housing, no health care, and zero support. We locked our hands together, said our vows, and prepared to face the Pacific Northwest as a team. When we finally landed in Washington, the landscape took my breath away. Coming from the flat, predictable hyper-seasons of Michigan, the Pacific Northwest felt like an entirely different planet. When it isn't raining, which to be fair is about 80% of the time, it is easily one of the most staggeringly beautiful places on the face of the earth. The base at Bangor was flanked by towering, ancient evergreen trees that looked like they belonged in a prehistoric era, massive snow-capped mountains jagged into the skyline, and within a 2-hour drive in any direction, you could find yourself lost in a rainforest, standing on a rugged ocean beach, or navigating a major city. The winters were incredibly mild compared to the brutal, bone-chilling freezes of home, rarely dropping real snow. Because we were married, the Navy had a small standard base house waiting for us the moment we arrived. Moving into that neighborhood was a bizarre mix of apprehension and deep excitement. We were two young kids from Michigan, setting up a kitchen, arranging furniture, and trying to pretend we knew how to run a household, while the shadow of the submarine base loomed just down the road. We only had about a month to get settled into our new routine before the reality of the service intervened. The USS Alabama was already out at sea on a strategic patrol, and they needed their new sonar technician on the watch bill. I was ordered to pack my sea bag and report to the airfield. I was flying out to Hawaii to meet the boat. My time in Oahu was a surreal, frustrating blur. I spent exactly 1 day on the island, tucked away in transit quarters, completely unable to experience the legendary tropical beauty of the place. My mind wasn't on the beaches or the palm trees anyway. It was entirely consumed by a tight, humming knot of nervous anxiety. I was a 19-year-old boy, still a boy by any realistic metric, preparing to board a multi-billion-dollar nuclear vessel that was currently operational in the middle of the ocean. The next morning, they marched us down to a naval transport ship. The engines roared to life, and we cleared the harbor, heading out into the deep, bright blue waters of the Pacific to intercept the submarine where she rolled on the surface. You can look at blueprints, diagrams, and photographs for years, but nothing prepares your brain for the sheer, staggering scale of an Ohio-class submarine when you see it floating in the open ocean. As the transport boat slowly pulled up alongside the hull, the USS Alabama looked like a massive, terrifying black island cutting through the water. Even with 70% of its massive cylinder hidden beneath the surface, the sheer volume of the iron was awe-inspiring. It looked solid, ancient, and completely indifferent to the human beings climbing onto its back. It was a beautiful, crisp morning. There were a handful of other sailors on the transport ship, but they were transit personnel heading to other vessels in the area. I was the solo replacement body boarding this specific submarine. I was entirely on my own. I stepped across the temporary brow, my boots hitting the rough black non-skid surface of the submarine's deck. The wind was whipping off the water, and the crew on deck didn't waste a single second on pleasantries. There was no welcome committee, no handshakes, and no orientation. "Hurry up, shipmate. Get your bag and get down the hatch so we can get this over with," a deckhand barked over the roar of the sea. I hauled my heavy sea bag across the curved metal deck, gripped the steel rungs of the vertical hatch, and slid down into the dark. The moment my boots cleared the ladder, the smell hit me like a physical blow to the chest. It was my first true hit of amine, the thick, sweet, chemical scent of recycled air mixed with the sharp undertones of hydraulic fluid and diesel grease. It hits your lungs like a freight train, instantly drying out your throat and signaling to your brain that you are officially out of oxygen and at the mercy of the ship's scrubbers. The first person I met at the bottom of the trunk was an STS-1 named Hogan. Hogan was a bit of a different individual within the division, but right from the jump, he and I clicked. He was a bit of a nerd, just like me, carrying a more serious intellectual demeanor than the loud, hyper-masculine sailors who dominated the engineering spaces. Hogan took his job incredibly seriously, and he was damn good at it. But he still knew how to navigate the dark humor of the boat. He gave me a brief, lightning-fast tour of the twisting metallic labyrinth of the decks, pointing out the safety valves and escape trunks before leading me to my berthing area. For my very first deployment, the luck of the draw fell in my favor. I didn't have to experience the psychological grind of hot racking right out of the gate. I was assigned to a temporary rack located directly inside the missile compartment, smack dab in the middle of the ship, tucked right between the massive vertical columns of the parts racks and the towering orangish-red tubes that held the ballistic missiles. It was completely devoid of privacy, surrounded by the constant thrum of pumps and the footsteps of watchstanders moving through the decks, but it was my space. I had a single curtain I could pull shut to lock out the lights of the boat. A few hours later, I was ordered to report to the sonar room for our dive sequence. I sat in the dim, glowing green light of the sonar shack, the headphones resting around my neck as the ship prepared to leave the surface. Over the internal squawk box, the standard commands echoed through the hull. "Dive, dive." I listened as the massive ballast tanks opened, the air venting out with a deep, roaring hiss as the Pacific Ocean rushed in to claim our buoyancy. The deck beneath my boots subtly tilted forward. The gentle rock of the surface waves vanished, replaced by the eerie, rock-solid stability of a submarine descending into the deep. A heavy, absolute smack of reality hit me right in the gut. This is real. You are thousands of feet below the sun, locked in an iron pipe with an atomic reactor, and there is no turning back. Looking at the glowing screens, surrounded by Hogan and the rest of my new division, the anxiety morphed into a clean, sharp focus. I was excited. I was proud. I was a young guy from Michigan who had fought his way onto the elite line of the silent service, and I was entirely eager to put my head down, learn the ship, and earn my place among the crew. Chapter 4: The Predator's Shield. To understand how easily a wolf can position himself as the shepherd, you have to understand the sheer crushing isolation of being an unqualified junior sailor on a ballistic missile submarine. Once my time in the scullery ended and I reported to the sonar division, my life became a frantic, high-stakes race against the clock. I was handed my qualification book, a thick binder of blank signature lines that felt less like an achievement record and more like a sentence. On a boomer, you carry that book everywhere. You are expected to spend every single second of your off-watch time crawling through the bilges, tracing high-pressure hydraulic lines, memorizing oxygen generator valve configurations, and begging senior petty officers for an interview. If you aren't studying, you are drawing maps of systems you barely understand. And the culture is deliberately hostile. Many qualified sailors treat their dolphins like a weapon, using their rank and their status to haze, demean, and gatekeep the junior guys. They will look at your drawing, rip it in half, and tell you to start over, because a single valve label is slightly out of alignment. You are permanently exhausted, running on 3 hours of fractured sleep in a hot rack, desperately looking for a single safe harbor where someone will just treat you like a human being. That was exactly when MM2 Miller stepped into my blind spot. It was around 0200 during the off watch. The mess decks were mostly deserted, cast in the low, dim red lighting the ship uses to preserve the crew's night vision. The only sound was the deep, rhythmic hum of the ventilation system and the distant metallic clanking of a pump somewhere in the auxiliary machinery spaces. I sat alone in one of the laminated booths, surrounded by a chaotic explosion of blueprints and high-pressure air system diagrams, my eyes burning from the glare of the overhead light. I was completely stuck on a complex piping layout, my brain misfiring from sheer fatigue. A shadow fell over the table. I looked up, my muscles automatically tensing, expecting a senior sailor to yell at me for taking up space. Instead, Miller stood there holding a mug of coffee. He wasn't sneering. He had this easy, relaxed, incredibly warm smile on his face. "Mind if I sit, shipmate?" he asked, his voice quiet, completely devoid of the standard military bark. "No, petty officer," I stammered, trying to quickly clear a space for him. He slid into the vinyl booth across from me, took a sip of his coffee, and looked down at my messy, hand-drawn diagrams. He didn't laugh at them. He just shook his head with a look of genuine older brother empathy. "Man, they are really putting you through the ringer, aren't they?" he said, his tone dripping with understanding. He reached across the table, took my pen, and with a few clean, practiced strokes, he connected the 2 valves I had been struggling to map out for an hour. "There. That's the bypass loop. Don't let the auxiliary Mac guys confuse you. It's simpler than it looks." I felt a sudden, massive wave of relief wash over my chest. The tight knot of anxiety in my stomach loosened for the first time in weeks. I looked at him and saw a lifeline. Miller leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, bringing his face closer into the dim perimeter of the booth. His eyes got serious, his voice dropping into a confidential, low register that instantly made me feel like I was being led into an exclusive inner circle. "Listen to me, ST," he said, using my rating like a sign of respect, even though I hadn't earned the crow on my sleeve yet. "I'm going to give you the real breakdown of how this boat works. There are fundamentally 2 types of people on this submarine. There are people who want to help you, and there are people who want to hurt you." I listened intently, completely hooked by his words. "There are a lot of absolute assholes on this ship," Miller continued, his jaw tightening slightly, as if he were genuinely angry on my behalf. "They survived the grind. They got their dolphins, and now they love using those silverfish against you just to make themselves feel big. They'll string you along, fail your checkouts, and try to break you just because they can." He pulled a blank scrap of paper toward him and wrote down 4 or 5 names. Senior petty officers and first classes across the engineering and supply divisions. "Stay away from these guys," Miller whispered, sliding the list across the table to me. "They're toxic. They'll look for any excuse to tank your qual card. If you need a signature for auxiliary systems, or if you ever get stuck on a diagram, don't go to them. Come find me. Anything you need, seriously, come find me. I'm here to help you get through this run intact. We misfits have to look out for each other." I picked up that piece of paper like it was a sacred shield. I looked at the names, then looked back at Miller, my chest swelling with a deep, profound sense of gratitude. I thought I had found a mentor. I thought I had found a protector who was willing to stand between a raw, vulnerable teenager and the meat grinder culture of the submarine fleet. It was the most brilliant, insidious piece of psychological warfare I have ever witnessed. Meanwhile, as I sat there thanking him, the terrifying truth was that the man sitting across from me, the man who had just drawn my diagrams and warned me about the monsters on the boat, was the number one person on that entire multi-billion-dollar warship that I actually needed to stay away from. By giving me that list of names, Miller wasn't protecting me from the predators. He was eliminating his competition. He was systematically poisoning the well, ensuring that if his behavior ever crossed the line, I would look at the rest of the shipmates around me and see enemies. He was cutting the ropes that connected me to the rest of the crew, building an invisible, solitary wall around my life until the only person I felt safe turning to was him. I folded his list, slipped it into my pocket, and went back to my rack that night, feeling like I finally had armor. I went to sleep believing that the machinist's mate was my sanctuary. I had no idea that I had just smiled, shaken hands, and walked willingly straight into the center of his web. Chapter 5. The Locked Grid. The math of an 8-hour watch rotation on a ballistic missile submarine is absolute, and when the command rewrote the watch bill halfway through that deployment, they effectively welded my schedule to MM2 Millers. I still remember stepping up to the clipboard in the missile compartment to check the new rotations, tracing my finger across the grid, and feeling a sudden, strange tightness in my throat. When I was awake, he was awake. When I stood watch, he stood watch. The loose, overlapping spaces of the boat where I used to find temporary anonymity were completely gone. We were locked into the exact same orbit, moving through the steel belly of the ship like two gears grinding together in the red light. But on that very first watch together under the new schedule, the monster didn't appear. Instead, the man who showed up was a friend. The initial shift was subtle. Miller slid into the space beside me, his demeanor relaxed and completely familiar. As we monitored the systems and watched the slow tick of the dials, the physical boundaries began to gently blur. It started with a hand on my shoulder as he leaned over to look at a gauge. A casual touch on the arm while making a joke. A slight, lingering brush of his frame against mine in the narrow confines of the watch station. It wasn't overtly sexual. It wasn't wildly inappropriate. It was just more than you would normally expect from a shipmate in a professional space. My internal alarm systems gave a quiet, tentative pulse, but I immediately forced the discomfort down. In the civilian world, and especially in the high-stress, cramped environment of the military, you run into people like that all the time. You meet guys who are just naturally touchy-feely, people who close the physical distance when they talk or throw an arm around you like an old coach. It's a little weird, sure, but it isn't uncommon. I stood there in my uniform and deliberately rationalized the danger away. You're being hypersensitive, I told myself. He's just an expressive guy. He's the one who gave you the list of people to stay away from, remember? He's the only guy on this whole boat who has your back. To lock the trap into place, Miller began an aggressive push into my personal life, using the ultimate camouflage, his own family. During those long, quiet hours on watch, he didn't talk about the sub or the Navy. He talked about his kids. His face would soften, his voice filled with pride as he told me stories about his children back home, painting a picture of a dedicated, wholesome family man who was just trying to survive the deployment to get back to his house. Then, he turned the mirror on me. He asked about my life. He asked about how I was handling the transition into being a married man, asking about my wife, our goals, and our home. "Man, you're doing great out here," Miller said, clapping a hand onto my back with a warm, paternal energy. "Listen, the second we get back to port in Washington, we need to get our families together. You and your wife can come over to the house, we'll fire up the grill, the kids can play, and we can actually relax. We're going to be real friends after this run." That was the masterstroke. Hearing him speak so passionately about his kids and planning a double date with our wives completely short-circuited my defenses. It felt incredibly good to be accepted by a seasoned petty officer on a level that felt like true, lifelong friendship. But psychologically, the manipulation went much deeper. By wrapping himself in the flag of fatherhood and family, Miller made it entirely impossible for me to trust my own instincts. How could I accuse a guy of crossing a line with his hands when he was simultaneously inviting my wife over for a barbecue, How could I think he was a predator when he was talking about his children? The wholesome image of the family man acted as a flawless psychological shield. If I felt uncomfortable when his hand lingered on my shoulder, I blamed myself. I assumed the flaw was in my own head, that I was misinterpreting a generous, affectionate mentor who was just lonely for his family. I leaned into the friendship completely. I opened up to him, shared my thoughts, and trusted him to guide me through the dark hull of the USS Alabama. I felt lucky to have him standing next to me on the grid. I had no idea that this was the final stage of the countdown. By forcing this deep, intense bond, Miller wasn't just building a friendship. He was ensuring that when the trap finally sprung, the sheer shock of the betrayal would leave me entirely paralyzed. He was building the walls of the cage out of my own trust, making sure that when the lights went red and the lock clicked shut, I would be too confused, too guilty, and too broken to ever scream for help. The wholesome talk about backyard barbecues and family reunions lasted only as long as it took for the routine of our shared rotation to set in. Over the course of the next month, the atmosphere inside the watch station began to steadily sour. The casual touches didn't stay casual. They became progressive, heavier, and calculated. The lingering hand on the shoulder moved down. The brushes in the narrow passageways became deliberate presses of weight. As the boundary lines were crossed more overtly, the fog of my own rationalization began to clear. The internal alarm bells weren't just pulsing anymore. They were screaming. There were a few times during those long shifts where the discomfort became too much to bear. I would physically step back, creating space between us in the cramped watch station. I look him in the eye and say the words, "Stop, back off," but he didn't stop. He just smiled or shrugged or went right back to the system gauges as if I hadn't spoken at all. When you tell someone to stop and they look right through you, it strips away your voice. It sends a terrifying message that your boundaries do not matter, and that within the steel walls of that submarine, you do not have control over your own skin. Yet, I was caught in a vicious systemic paradox. I needed his signatures. To get off hot racking, to be viewed as a human being by the command, and to escape the vulnerability of being a non-qual, I had to get that leather book signed. Because of our locked watch bills, Miller was the senior petty officer available to vet my progress. I became completely, structurally reliant on the very person who was violating my space. By the end of that month, it felt like half the ink on my qualification card belonged to him. Every time he handwrote his initials on a line, it felt like he was buying another piece of my silence. He knew exactly what that book meant to me. He knew it was my lifeline, and he used it as an invisible leash. So I did the only thing a trapped animal can do. I focused entirely on the exit strategy. I channeled my anxiety into a manic, high-speed academic sprint. If the qualification card was the trap, then finishing it was the only way out. I studied until my eyes bled. I memorized the acoustics, the sonar grids, and the ship's schematics with flawless precision. I made spectacular progress in every single aspect of my qualifications, mastering all my sonar specs ahead of schedule. My division commanders looked at me and saw a superstar junior tech crashing through his boards. They had no idea I was just running for my life. I convinced myself that this nightmare had an expiration date. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on the horizon, telling myself a beautiful, desperate lie every time I had to sit across from Miller to get a signature. Just endure it for a few more weeks. Keep your head down, get the ink, and pass the boards. Once you have your dolphins, everything changes. Once you wear the silver fish, you're untouchable. He won't be able to leverage the card against you anymore. Just get the fish. I was putting all my chips on that silver medal. I truly believed that earning my place in the silent service would act as armor, breaking the gridlock and setting me free. I didn't realize that the predator was simply letting me run out the length of the leash, waiting for the perfect moment of maximum physical exhaustion to yank it back. Chapter 6: The Midwatch Shadow. The clock on a ballistic missile submarine doesn't care about day or night, but the human biological clock always registers the exact second it hits midnight. At exactly 0000, the watch standard flipped. I stood up from my glowing workstation in the sonar shack, stretched my aching back until the joints popped, and was officially relieved by the incoming mid-watch crew. After hours of staring intently at the glowing green acoustic waterfalls of the sonar screens, my head was swimming with static, and my stomach was completely empty. I climbed down the narrow, steep metal ladders to the mess decks to grab what the Navy calls mid-rats, midnight rations. That specific night, the culinary specialist had whipped up chicken cordon bleu, or hamsters, as we cynically called them in the fleet. In the grand scheme of culinary art, they were objectively pretty disgusting, processed, rubbery blocks of mystery meat floating in a pool of lukewarm grease. But in terms of mid-rats, they were a luxury. On a bad night, you were stuck eating the exact same dried-out, rubbery leftovers you'd swallowed 6 hours earlier. Finding a tray of hot hamsters felt like a minor victory in the dark. I ate quickly, swallowing the fuel, then headed straight toward the back of the boat. I was fiercely determined to use my off-watch time wisely. I spent the next few hours navigating the roaring, high-pressure, blistering hot labyrinth of the engine room, tracking complex auxiliary systems for my reactor qualifications. The sailors who volunteer to become nuclear technicians, the nukes, are, to put it mildly, a highly interesting breed of human beings. They operate in a completely different, isolated psychological ecosystem than the forward support crew. They are hyper-intelligent, deeply eccentric, incredibly intense, and definitely a different group of people than anyone I had ever crossed paths with back home in Michigan. But that night, I found a perfect operational rhythm with them. I crawled through the tight steel frameworks, traced the winding pipelines through the steam, and successfully secured one of the last hardest signatures I needed for the engineering section of my qualification binder. When I finally climbed back up out of the engine room hatches, I was actually riding a wave of fantastic momentum. My confidence was high. With the reactor signatures checked off, I only needed to master the complex trim and drain system to have a complete, definitive handle on my qualifications. I was right on the precipice of getting my silver dolphins pinned to my chest before the deployment even ended. The finish line was physically in sight. Exhausted but running on pure adrenaline, I walked back to my berthing area. I grabbed my towel, my soap bar, and the basic hygiene supplies I needed to take a shower, and stepped down the narrow, red-lit passageway toward the ship's head. It was a walk I had done almost every single day for the last 2 months. Nothing felt out of place. There were no warning signs, no structural shifts in the ambient hum of the propulsion system, and no unexpected shadows on the metal bulkheads. I stepped through the heavy insulated metal door of the head and walked into the shower space. Submarine architecture is an exercise in extreme, suffocating claustrophobia, but the crew showers are the tightest, most restrictive confines on the entire vessel. The space consists of exactly 2 coffin-like stalls, facing directly across from one another, separated by a common floor drainage plate that is barely the size of a single person's stance. It is a wet, metallic box where your elbows violently strike the bulkheads if you turn around too fast. The hot water was already running in the empty stall, filling the tight parameters of the space with a heavy, suffocating wall of thick steam. I was completely undressed, stepping toward the frame of the stall when the heavy outer metal door of the head swung open and clicked shut. "Coming in," a familiar voice echoed sharply through the tile box. It was MM2 Miller. The sound of his voice hit my spine like a raw electric shock. The fantastic mood I had carried out of the engine room vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, tightening coil of pure dread that bottomed out my stomach. Seeking an immediate physical barrier, I jumped into the left side of the shower stall and violently pulled the thin plastic curtain shut, trying to slide into the safety of the running water. I could feel the shift in the air pressure before it even materialized. Every single instinct written into my DNA told me something was profoundly, terribly wrong. A split second later, the plastic curtain rings screeched along the metal rod as the curtain was ripped open with a sudden, violent force. The movement was explicitly meant to startle me, to strip away my physical defenses before my brain could even process the velocity of the intrusion. Before I could clear the water from my eyes to breathe, he was inside the coffin-like stall with me, crowding out the air. He grabbed me. He touched me, his hands heavy, authoritative, and unyielding, and forcefully controlled my body, forcing my hands to touch his skin. The entire ordeal probably only lasted a minute or two in chronological real time, but inside a traumatized mind, time fractures completely into static. The clock stopped. To me, it felt like endless, agonizing hours were slowly passing inside that steaming, wet tile box. My body underwent a radical, involuntary biological shutdown, a circuit breaker flipping in my brain. I went completely cold, numb, and blank. My mind was a chaotic masterpiece of absolute terror, screaming at me from the inside to do something, to fight back, to yell for help, to make the nightmare stop. But the physical, neurological connection between my brain and my muscles was completely severed. I had never been in a situation of predatory violence like this in my entire life. I had zero frame of reference for this kind of violation, and my survival center handled the catastrophic sensory overload by simply turning the lights off. I was entirely, completely paralyzed, frozen in place like an animal caught in the blinding glare of an oncoming truck. I felt completely helpless. I felt entirely alone, thousands of feet beneath the dark surface of the Pacific Ocean, trapped in a steel box with a monster who outranked me and held my career in his hands. During the entire assault, he spoke absolutely no words, and neither did I. The heavy silence inside that stall was louder than the roaring machinery of the submarine's engines. When his grip finally released and the outer door of the head slammed shut with a metallic thud, the silence rushed back into the room like a flood. I stood there under the running water, my chest heaving, a toxic, burning mix of shock and shame settling deep into my bone marrow. I grabbed the soap bar and began to scrub my skin. I washed myself with a frantic, desperate, and violent intensity, rubbing the washcloth against my torso and limbs until the skin was red, raw, and burning. I didn't want a single microscopic trace of his touch left on my body. I wanted to gouge the violation out of my pores. I wanted him, his heavy hands, and his distinct chemical scent completely washed down the drain. But no matter how hot the water got, or how hard I dug into my skin, the phantom feeling of the grease wouldn't wash away. I pulled my uniform back on, my hands shaking as I buttoned the fabric, stepped out of the head, and walked down the passageway back to my berthing area. I moved through the compartments with a completely blank, vacant stare, looking clean through the metal bulkheads and the shipmates who passed me by in the corridors. I crawled into my narrow rack, pulled the thin blue curtain shut to lock out the entire world, and finally let the tears come. I lay there in the dark, weeping silently into my coarse pillow so the sailors sleeping in the bunks just inches away wouldn't hear the noise. The pride I had felt an hour ago in the engine room was entirely, brutally obliterated. I felt weak. I felt hollowed out, systematically stripped of my dignity and completely disconnected from my own identity. I didn't even feel like a human being anymore. I felt like a broken object that had been used and casually discarded in the dark. As the submarine pushed forward through the deep, my mind locked into a vicious looping nightmare. I began to replay the scenario over and over again on a permanent, agonizing tape, torturing my own sanity with the same unyielding questions. What should I have done? What could I have done? Why didn't I fight back? I didn't know then that the freeze response was a biological circuit design keeping me alive. All I knew, as I stared blankly at the dark overhead panel of my bunk, was that the confident boy who had written his senator and fought the Marine Corps was dead, and the long silent war for my survival had officially begun. Chapter 7. The Ghost in the Hull. The worst part about surviving a violation inside a locked steel pipe is the realization that the calendar keeps moving, the watch bill stays active, and the ocean doesn't care that your world has just ended. It didn't stop with that one night during the reactor examination. Over the remainder of that deployment, it happened 2 more times. The monster had completely discarded his family man mask, and I was entirely at the mercy of a repeat predator who knew exactly how to leverage his rank and the claustrophobic geography of the ship against a terrified junior sailor. The days following those events were turbulent, to say the very least. I didn't know how to act. I didn't know how to feel. My internal compass was entirely shattered, spinning wildly in the dark. The only survival mechanism my brain could come up with was a desperate, unyielding need for distraction. I had to force my mind away from my own skin by any shape or form possible. To survive the physical environment of the ship, my avoidance tactics degenerated into a state of total desperation. I stopped using the crew's head altogether. It got to the point where I went 3 full weeks without taking a single shower. I became a phantom inside my own division. I made up every wild, frantic excuse I could think of to avoid going into the bathroom spaces. My close friends in the sonar room didn't know the horrific truth of what was happening, but they saw their shipmate running on pure panic. They quietly helped me survive, tracking down extra packs of wet wipes and hygiene supplies so I could clean myself in the dark privacy of my office rack. When the wet wipes weren't enough, I resorted to a high-stakes tactical risk. I started sneaking into the officer's private bathroom. On a submarine, the forward officer spaces, the wardroom heads, are strictly off-limits to enlisted crew. Trespassing in those corridors can bring a mountain of disciplinary trouble down on a junior tech's head, but the fear of a captain's reprimand was absolutely nothing compared to the primal terror of running into MM2 Miller in the crew's stalls. I would wait until the middle of the night watches, ensure the passageway was clear, and slip into the officer's head like a thief, just to wash my face and brush my teeth without the threat of a heavy metallic lock sliding shut behind me. I channeled the remainder of my manic, panicked energy entirely into my studies. I completely cut Miller out of my life as a resource. I refused to go to him for another single signature, blueprint explanation, or system checkout. Luckily, by the grace of God, I had already secured the bulk of the engineering signatures I needed from his division before the first assault. I buried my face in my manuals, memorizing systems, tracking lines, and pushing myself through the qualification boards with a terrifying velocity born of pure survival instinct. At the very end of that grueling deployment, the hard work paid off. I passed my final boards. I had earned my silver dolphins. The pinning ceremony on a submarine is supposed to be the proudest moment of a sailor's life. The crew gathers in the mess decks, the captain speaks about your dedication, and you are officially welcomed into the elite brotherhood of the silent service. You are no longer a ghost. You are a qualified submariner. I stood before the command, the silver fish being pinned onto my uniform chest, breathing a massive, exhausted sigh of relief. I thought the medal would be my shield. I thought the nightmare was officially over. Then I looked out into the crowd of gathered sailors. Standing right there, watching me intently, was MM2 Miller. He was clapping his hands along with the rest of the crew, his eyes locked onto mine. He had the most devious, arrogant, knowing smile plastered across his face that you could ever imagine. It was a silent, chilling message that traveled straight through the applause. "Here's your dolphins, kid. Wear your silver fish. It doesn't change a damn thing. I still own you." The silver on my uniform felt instantly cold. The greatest achievement of my young life had been completely corrupted, stained by the shadow of the man clapping in the front row. Chapter 8. The Chasm at Home. When the Alabama finally floated back into the harbor of Naval Base Kitsap Bangor and the hatches opened to the fresh Washington air, I made a firm, desperate promise to myself. I told myself that I was going to leave the horror at the bottom of the Pacific. I convinced myself that now that I was a qualified submariner with dolphins on my chest, the trauma wouldn't affect me ashore. I was going to walk through my front door, embrace my new wife, and pretend the last few months had been nothing but a standard run at sea. The complete and total opposite happened. The secret didn't stay on the pier. It behaved like a heavy, suffocating fog that rolled right into our house, settling into every room. The moment I tried to return to normal life, my brain underwent a massive systemic collapse. I didn't just dissociate from the military. I completely dissociated from everything and everyone in my universe, including my wife. I didn't realize the depth of the disappearance while it was happening. When you are drowning in trauma, your mind numbs your perception to protect you from the pain. But the reality was that I simply wasn't there. I became a hollow shell, occupying a seat at the dinner table. To avoid facing the horrific reality that my life had been forever altered, I began to bury myself in any high-focus distraction I could find to keep the wheels of my mind spinning too fast to look backward. I escaped into video games for hours on end, losing myself in digital worlds where I had absolute control over the character on the screen. I started playing poker and driving out to the local casinos. I wasn't being financially reckless. I wasn't throwing our life savings away on the tables, but I desperately needed the intense mathematical focus of the cards. I needed the lights, the chips, and the high-stakes calculations to completely consume my cognitive bandwidth. I needed my mind off of what had been done to me, even if it only bought me a few hours of peace at a time. But the place where the silence did the most devastating damage was our bedroom. Every time I tried to get intimate with my wife, the system completely broke down. The moment the lights went out and the physical closeness started, the walls of the submarine shower stall would flash behind my eyelids. M2. Miller was the very first thing that popped into my head. His hands, his weight, his heavy scent. The memory of the violation would instantly flood my nervous system, short-circuiting my ability to feel safe, to feel masculine, or to feel love. It wrecked me to my absolute core. I was a young, newlywed husband who desperately loved his wife. But my body and my mind treated physical intimacy like a combat zone. I didn't know I was pulling away from her at the time. I thought I was just tired, or stressed from the off-crew schedule, or dealing with standard deployment fatigue. I didn't realize that every time I stayed up until dawn playing video games, every time I left for the casino, and every time I turned away from her in the dark, I was building an unbridgeable chasm between our souls. But she knew it. She felt the sudden, freezing distance of a husband who had sailed away a 19-year-old boy and come back a stranger. She could see the hollow space where my presence used to be, watching me retreat deeper and deeper into the dark vault of my own head. And eventually, as the weeks rolled on and the silence grew heavier, the fog lifted just enough for me to look across the room and finally see the distance myself. The sanctuary I had fought so hard to build ashore was quietly fracturing, and I was entirely powerless to stop the bleeding. Chapter 9. The Illusion of Armor. Even when you are fighting for your life every single day in the quiet aftermath of trauma, the world doesn't stop turning. The Navy keeps moving, and inside the dark off-season ashore, a few small glimmers of real good managed to break through the fog. I was officially promoted to Sonar Technician 3rd Class, an STS-3. The promotion came with a much-needed bump in pay, which was a welcome relief for a young married couple trying to survive a brutal national recession. But the financial shift wasn't what mattered most to me. The true value of those new chevrons was psychological. For months, I had felt like an invisible, discarded object in the lower flats of the ship. Now, with a 3rd-class crow on my sleeve and silver dolphins pinned to my chest, I felt like I was finally someone. I had earned my place in the silent service. I felt a renewed sense of military bearing, a solid structure, and somewhat of a real purpose. I was a petty officer now. I had authority. I had a division that respected my technical progress, and I carried myself with a new, protective pride. But lurking constantly in the back of my mind, like a low-frequency sonar ping that you can't tune out, was the thought of the next deployment. As the date of our return to the pier drew nearer and nearer, The fragile peace I'd built ashore began to evaporate. The anxiety inside my chest kept rising and rising, a slow-moving tide of pure terror. I was scared to death of what was waiting for me back out in the dark water. Yet, beneath the fear, I was also fiercely hopeful. I spent hours and hours awake at night, staring at the dark bedroom ceiling while my wife slept beside me, running through tactical defensive plans in my head. I used those quiet midnight hours to build a fortress out of my new status. I became deeply optimistic that my dolphins and my NCO rank were going to protect me. I convinced myself that the playing field had shifted. I wasn't the defenseless, terrified non-qual in the scullery anymore. I was a petty officer. This time is going to be different, I promised myself in the dark. I am going to be better. I am going to stand my ground, and I will finally protect myself. I built that illusion of armor out of pure desperation, wrapping myself in my new stripes, praying they would be thick enough to keep the monster away. Then the off-crew cycle ended. The gold crew returned from their run, tied the ship to the concrete pier, and handed the keys of the USS Alabama back to the blue crew. The exact second my boots stepped across the brow and onto that black hull for the first time in months, the illusion shattered. A primal, suffocating panic like nothing I had ever experienced in my entire life slammed into my chest. All the midnight promises, the optimism, and the confidence of my new rank were completely vaporized in a single breath of amine-soaked air. My body remembered what my mind had tried to polish over. My heart immediately started redlining, hammering against my ribs at what felt like 200 beats per minute. I could feel the adrenaline rushing through my veins so violently it felt like my blood was literally boiling inside of me. The physical walls of the submarine seemed to close in around my shoulders, trapping me instantly, screaming at me that I was right back in the hunting ground. For better or for worse, however, a nuclear submarine has absolutely zero room for a sailor's feelings. The ship is a relentless, unyielding machine that demands constant human labor to stay alive. On a boat, you do not have the luxury of time to sit in a corner and relish in your own panic. The moment I cleared the hatch ladder, the operational tempo caught me. Somebody always had a job for you. There was always a station to check, an acoustic manual to update, a deck to scrub, or a piece of equipment to clean. Before the panic attack could completely pull me under the waves, the machine intervened. I was handed a rag, assigned a task, and pushed right into the daily grinding momentum of the crew. Thankfully, I didn't have to sit alone with the terror of that moment for very long. My mind got the brutal, immediate distraction it desperately needed just to survive the first day back on board. I put my head down, gripped my tools, and let the exhausting routine of the ship swallow my thoughts, hiding behind the petty officer I had worked so hard to become while the submarine prepared to slide back into the deep. Chapter 10. The Tactical Countdown. Before a ballistic missile submarine slides out for a strategic patrol, the ship belongs to the pier for about a month. This in-port phase is a chaotic, relentless transition. The gold crew has stepped off, and the blue crew takes custody of the hull, preparing the ship for the unforgiving months ahead. The decks are flooded with civilian contractors. Crate after crate of food supplies are packed into the deck spaces, and major mechanical repairs are hammered out. For me, that month in port was a strange, vital buffer. Deep down inside, a quiet instinct told me I was safe as long as we were tied to the concrete pier. The environment was too open, too busy, and too heavily monitored for MM2 Miller to play his games. Whenever our paths crossed on the shore or in the main passageways during refit work, I executed a strategy of total psychological ghosting. I simply pretended he didn't exist in my universe. I wouldn't look at him. I wouldn't stand next to him. I wouldn't acknowledge his voice. If he walked into a compartment, I looked right through him as if he were made of glass, completely erasing him from my world. But a port cycle only lasts 4 weeks, and the concrete pier eventually runs out. As the deployment date loomed closer, I shifted from passive avoidance into high-gear tactical preparation. I treated my sea bag like a survival cache for a siege. I packed an almost unhealthy amount of dry shampoo, heavy-duty baby wipes, and those tiny, disposable, waterless toothbrushes. My mission was clear. I was going to bypass the crew showers entirely. But a backup plan is only as good as its contingencies. If my hygiene stash failed, or if the sweat of the boat forced me into a corner, I needed an escape route. During my time ashore, I had managed to build a genuine, mutual respect with one of the ship's officers. On a submarine, the dividing line between officers and enlisted crew is usually an absolute wall. The Navy frowns heavily on casual mingling between the ranks. But when you are locked in an iron pipe together, the human element always breaks through the instructions. You quickly realize there are fundamentally two types of officers on a boat. You have your hurrah, Navy is life guys who sleep with the manual under their pillow. And then you have your down-to-earth guys who just want to do their jobs professionally and treat people like human beings. Everyone on the crew naturally tried to stay as far away from the former as possible, but the down-to-earth guys were the ones you actually trusted when things went sideways. I never opened up to this officer about the horrific reality of what Miller had done to me. The shame was still far too thick to put into words. Instead, I sat down with him privately and told him I was dealing with some severe, unpredictable digestive health issues. He didn't interrogate me. He didn't ask for medical paperwork. He just looked at me, saw the genuine stress in my eyes, and nodded. "If you ever need to use the forward wardroom heads to handle it, petty officer, you go," he told me flatly. "If anyone catches you up there and tries to write you up, you tell them you're on my details. I've got your back." Securing that alliance felt like a massive strategic victory. For the first time since the mid-watch shadow fell over my life, I felt fully prepared. I had a plan, I had an alibi, I had a survival cache, and I was fiercely determined to make this deployment entirely different from the last. When the hatches finally slammed shut and the Alabama slipped beneath the waves to begin our strategic watch, that preparation translated into a surge of genuine professional excitement. I had just officially qualified for the TAWS, the Towed Array Workstation. On an Ohio-class submarine, the towed array is the crown jewel of your acoustic sensors. It is a massive, miles-long cable lined with highly sensitive hydrophones that the ship reels out from the ballast tanks, towing it far behind the hull to listen to the deep ocean without the interference of our own machinery noise. Operating the TAWS was the ultimate next step up in the sonar qualification ladder. It officially moved me off the basic broadband screens where the raw, unpolished new guys were forced to sit. I was finally operating at an advanced level. I didn't have to feel like the helpless, vulnerable kid anymore. I was a true hunter in the dark. For the first few weeks at sea, the architecture of my defensive plan worked flawlessly. Miller and I were locked onto the exact same watch rotation, meaning we were in the same operational spaces for 8 hours at a time. But the moment the watch was handed over, my shadow campaign began. I turned myself into an internal FBI spy, meticulously tracking his every movement through the ship. I memorized his habits with a chilling precision. I calculated exactly when he ate his meals, exactly when he went to his rack, and exactly which corridors he walked during his off hours. If he was awake, I forced myself to stay in my bunk or tucked away in the sonar shack. If he was asleep, I used those hours to move through the ship, email my wife, and breathe. I altered my entire biological clock to run completely opposite to his, treating the 560-foot submarine like a chessboard, where I was always 3 moves ahead of his position. It was a brilliant, exhausting display of pure psychological endurance. I was surviving, I was excelling at my workstation, and I was successfully keeping the monster at bay. but running a counterintelligence campaign against a shipmate while simultaneously operating a multi-billion-dollar warship takes a devastating toll on the human nervous system. Your adrenaline is permanently redlining. You are never truly resting, even when your eyes are closed. And inside the absolute, unyielding mechanics of a long submarine deployment, a spy can only run the board for so long before exhaustion slips a cog, and the grid catches up to you. Chapter 11. The Mid-Run Gauntlet. The strategic rhythm of a 4-month boomer patrol is designed to wear you down through sheer monotony, but right smack dab in the middle of the deployment, the monotony is violently shattered. We cut through the deep waters of the Pacific and made a secret rendezvous near Hawaii to pick up a specialized team of naval inspectors. They boarded our hull for the ultimate shipboard crucible, the ORE, or Operational Reactor Examination. An ORE is a high-stakes, multi-day gauntlet designed to push both the crew and the ship to their absolute physical limits. To be fair, the primary target of this inspection isn't the forward part of the submarine where the sonar division lives. The real pressure cooker is dropped directly onto the aft part of the ship, the engine room, the nuclear machinists, and the machinists' mates. They are the ones whose every valve, turn, and gauge reading is scrutinized by the top brass. But on a submarine, when the back of the ship bleeds, the front of the ship feels the pain. The moment the inspectors cleared the hatches, the submarine descended into a 24/7 state of artificial warfare. The alarms became unceasing. There were reactor casualty drills, fire drills, and flooding drills. Every catastrophic, worst-case scenario you could possibly think of was thrown at us simultaneously. The Navy was intentionally trying to put us to the test to see exactly how we would respond when the world started falling apart. And honestly, standing there in my uniform, I completely understood why they had to do it. It made perfect sense. If you are operating a multi-billion-dollar strategic nuclear asset under the ocean, you have to be absolutely certain that the crew knows how to handle a truly crappy situation the exact second it arises. There is no room for hesitation when a line ruptures or a reactor drops its load. For 3 or 4 grueling days, the inspectors rode the ship, testing our endurance and pushing the entire crew into a state of survival mode. The peak of the examination was a brutal 48-hour window right in the middle, where the most intense back-to-back operational tests were conducted. During those 2 days, sleep became a myth. The watch rotations dissolved into an endless loop of battle stations and casualty containment. Your eyes burned from the harsh, constant glare of the screens. Your brain turned to pure static from the relentless wail of the alarms, and your body vibrated from a toxic mix of caffeine and raw adrenaline. In the sonar division, we had one tiny secret tactical advantage. Directly behind the main sonar shack sits the array workstation, the specialized compartment where we monitor and deploy the massive towed array cable behind the submarine. When the towed array was fully deployed and stable, the space became a quiet, isolated pocket cut off from the main flow of traffic. Occasionally, if you were smart and kept your ears tuned to the decks, you could sneak back behind the workstation partitions and catch a quick, desperate 20-minute nap on the deck plating, completely out of sight, while waiting for the next drill to detonate over the ship's circuit. Those tiny, stolen moments of sleep were the only things keeping my mind from coming entirely unhinged. Generally speaking, though, I went nearly 48 hours straight without closing my eyes for more than a few minutes at a time. I was running on pure instinct, a petty officer executing my TAWS tracking with flawless mechanical precision, while my physical tank dropped all the way to absolute zero. We fought through every single drill. We mastered every operational test, contained every simulated flood, and safely handled every reactor casualty the inspection team threw at us. When the gauntlet finally ended, we rolled back up to the surface near Hawaii, opened the hatches to the tropical air, and handed the ORE team back off to a transit vessel. The second their boots cleared the deck and the hatches slammed shut to take us back down into the deep, the adrenaline that had sustained the crew for 4 days completely evaporated. A profound, crushing wave of systemic exhaustion settled into my bones. I walked back to my berthing area, my uniform stiff with dried sweat, my skin raw, and my mind completely numb from sleep deprivation. My FBI spy defensive strategy of tracking Miller's sleep cycles was totally short-circuited by the fatigue. I couldn't calculate schedules anymore. I couldn't run the chessboard. I was simply a tired human being whose defenses had been entirely stripped away by 48 hours of continuous warfare. I looked down at my sea bag, then looked at my hands. Because of my intense panicked avoidance strategy, I had managed to go the entire first half of the deployment without touching the crew's head. I had lived exclusively out of baby wipes and chemical powders, but the ORE had broken my system. I was completely filthy, covered in the grease of the engine room system traces and the sweat of the drills. The wipes weren't going to cut it anymore. My guard was completely down, lowered by the overwhelming relief of passing the inspection and the absolute collapse of my physical energy. I grabbed my towel. I gathered my soap. And for only the third time in that entire 2-month patrol, I stepped down the red-lit corridor and walked into the crew's shower stall, completely unaware that the safety I had fought so hard to engineer ashore was about to be obliterated by the reality of the deep. Chapter 12, The Shattered Shield. I had spent weeks operating under the absolute delusion that I was the smartest player on the board. I was the vigilant gazelle, mapping out watch schedules, utilizing my contraband wet wipes, and tracking my abuser's movements through the ship like a counterintelligence spy. But a gazelle is still prey. And Miller was the lion in the weeds, possessing years of experience inside that steel hull, silently watching me close my eyes as the total exhaustion of the 48-hour operational reactor examination finally caught up to my system. He didn't need to outrun my defensive strategy. He just had to wait for the Navy's machine to break my physical tank down to absolute zero. This was his moment, and he took it with a terrifying calculated precision. I was standing in the common area of the crew's head, completely undressed and preparing to step into the left shower stall, when the heavy outer metal door slammed shut. Only this time, the heavy echo was followed by a sound that made my stomach completely bottom out. The sharp, metallic click of the lock sliding into place. For a single, desperate, and pathetic split second, my mind tried to hold on to a shred of hope. Maybe it's someone else, the voice whispered frantically inside my head. Maybe it's just a shipmate who wants privacy for a wash. But deep down in my bones, I knew. I knew exactly what was about to step through the heavy wall of steam. The inner stall curtain swung open. Before I could even clear the thick fatigue from my throat to utter a coherent sentence, the words choked hard in my mouth. I managed to start a plea, something born of pure, unadulterated panic. "Hey, I don't want any trouble." He didn't answer me. He threw me violently into the left side of the coffin-like shower stall, yanked down my towel, and proceeded to rape me. The entire assault happened with a fierce, crushing velocity that I had never experienced in my life, accompanied by a state of absolute, suffocating helplessness that I cannot even begin to explain to someone who hasn't been trapped beneath the ocean floor. There was no room to move, no air to breathe, and nowhere to run. I don't know how long it lasted. The clock inside my head fractured completely into jagged pieces. But every microscopic, clinical detail of those minutes haunts the parameters of my mind to this very day. I distinctly remember the cold, unyielding, textured feel of the steel bulkhead. My forehead was pushed so violently, so single-mindedly into the metal panel that it left a physical, raw indentation on my skin. I braced my hands against the ship's frame, my mind completely separating from my body like a ghost, as the heavy machinery of the submarine hummed through the steel straight against my skullbone. When the door finally clicked open, and his shadow vanished back into the red light of the passageway, the heavy silence rolled back over the wet stall. I collapsed heavily onto the wet deck plating. I sat there on the floor of the stall, the water turned up as high and as blistering hot as the ship's boilers could physically pump it, bleeding heavily out of a place a man should never bleed from. I stared blankly into the gray steel casing of the shower structure, uncontrollably crying, wishing with every fiber of my soul that I was someone else. I wished I could be anywhere on the face of the planet, but inside that iron pipe. The exact same toxic thoughts from my first deployment rushed back into my head on a vicious mocking loop. Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? Why didn't you fight back? Why did you allow this to happen to you again? Why weren't you stronger? You're an STS-3 now. You have your dolphins. Why didn't your armor hold? I didn't understand that the freeze response was an involuntary biological circuit. I didn't know that my brain had flooded my system with chemicals to paralyze me so I would survive the physical trauma without tearing the ship's order apart. All I knew was the shame. Miller hadn't just violated my body. He had systematically stripped away every last piece of professional dignity and manhood I thought I had built up during the off-crew cycle. The days following the ORE didn't pass in regular hours. They felt like entire, grueling years. I was moving through the sonar shack like a walking corpse, my face a vacant mask of hollow static. I was acting so visibly weird and checked out that my own division took notice. Worried about my sudden deterioration, they eventually ordered me to go down and see the doc. On a nuclear submarine, there are no actual doctors. There are no psychologists, no specialists, and no medical suites. Doc is simply an enlisted independent duty corpsman. At absolutely no fault of his own, a corpsman's entire world revolves around basic trauma triage. He knows how to stitch up a laceration, how to hand out cold medicine, and how to stabilize war wounds until the ship can make port. He was entirely unequipped to read the invisible wreckage of military sexual trauma. I sat in the cramped medical space, the metal cabinets rattling rhythmically against the bulkhead, as he looked over his clipboard. He kept asking me what was wrong, trying to find a physical diagnosis for the ghost sitting in front of him. I just looked at him with a blank, vacant glare. I just don't feel well, Doc, I said quietly. What else was I supposed to say? How was a 21-year-old kid supposed to force the words I was raped by a machinist's mate past his teeth on a nuclear submarine? Who would have believed me? Miller was an established second class, an integrated gear in the engineering division. On a boat, if a junior guy levels an accusation like that without physical proof, the rumor mill and the chain of command will crush you long before the paperwork ever leaves the captain's stateroom. I kept the vault locked. I told myself a desperate survivalist lie. This is Miller's last deployment. He's transferring off the boat after this run. If you can just survive the next few weeks, he'll be gone forever. I decided to swallow the horror and simply battle it forward by pure brute force endurance. But the emotional agony wasn't the only shadow that followed me out of that headspace. The physical damage refused to be ignored. The bleeding and the intense internal pain continued every single day. Every time the watch bill allowed me a brief break to go to the bathroom, the experience was excruciating. A sharp, burning reminder of the bulkhead that left me shaking in the stall. I couldn't ask medical for real help without exposing the secret, so I improvised. I went back to the corpsman and claimed I was suffering from severe, permanent, chronic headaches. It was the only cover story that made sense of why I was constantly pale, acting strange and limping through the compartments. They handed me bottles of standard issue Motrin. That became my daily ration of survival. I swallowed the pills, choked back the blood, and walked back up the ladders to the TAWS station, hiding the agony behind my petty officer's uniform, while the submarine pushed silently through the dark, carrying a broken sailor toward a pier that could no longer offer a real sanctuary. Chapter 13. The Armor of Iron. The human mind has a mercy mechanism. It will simply turn off the tape when the recording becomes too painful to play back. Of the remaining weeks of that second deployment, I honestly do not remember much of anything. My brain executed a total cognitive blackout, burying the daily watches and the passage of time beneath a thick layer of protective static. I stood my rotations at the TAWS station. I tracked the acoustic signatures of the deep, and I walked the metal decks like a machine. But beneath the numbness, two absolute, unyielding realities crystallized in the center of my chest. First, I never took a shower on that submarine again. For the rest of my time on the USS Alabama, I completely surrendered the luxury of running water at sea. I relied entirely on my shadow routine of contraband wet wipes, chemical powders, and dry shampoo, taking care of my personal hygiene in the total isolation of my bunk space. It sounds gross to anyone who hasn't had to survive a predator inside an iron pipe, but I didn't care about comfort anymore. I cared about survival. I ran my own play, kept my head down, and ensured my guard was never lowered enough to step back into a tile box. Second, I made the hard, definitive decision that I would never, ever re-enlist in the United States Navy. I lay in my narrow rack during the quiet off hours, staring at the metallic overhead panels just inches from my face, and drew a boundary line in the stone. The military had promised me an escape route from a collapsing Michigan economy in 2008, but the cost of the ticket had become far too high. I told myself that no matter how bad the recession got ashore, and no matter what kind of financial bonuses they threw at my technical rate, I was never going to sign another contract that gave the government ownership over my physical safety. I was going to finish my 4 years, take my discharge papers, and protect my future self from ever being trapped like this again. My contract was no longer a career path. It was a prison sentence with a definitive release date. But a passive exit strategy wasn't enough to stop the toxic self-blame that was eating my insides. The shame needed a physical release valve, and I found it in the ship's gym equipment. Toward the final stretch of that deployment, I started losing an immense amount of weight. The stress and the internal damage from the assaults were ravaging my system, and when I looked at my reflection, I hated the lack of muscle tone I saw. In the twisted, defensive logic of a traumatized young guy, I convinced myself that the assault was fundamentally my fault because I hadn't been strong enough to stop it. I believed Miller had looked at my average, unmuscled frame and targeted me for my weakness. I channeled that burning self-hatred into a manic, unyielding obsession with physical fitness. Submarine exercise spaces are tiny, improvised corners, usually just a couple of free weights, a bench, or a pull-up bar wedged directly between the massive orange tubes of the missile compartment upper flats. I engulfed myself in that iron with a fierce, terrifying voracity. Every single waking moment of my off-watch time that wasn't claimed by qualification manuals was spent moving weight. I lifted until my muscles redlined, pushed through the exhaustion of the deployment, and forced my body to break down and rebuild itself thicker. I wasn't training for health, and I wasn't training for sports. I was building a human fortress out of my own skin. I truly believed that if I could just pack enough dense, heavy muscle over my frame, I could create a visual deterrent so imposing that no man on earth would ever look at me and see prey again. I wanted to look dangerous enough to guarantee my own safety. To this very day, I still carry the phantom weight of that exact same psychological equation. The gym isn't a casual hobby for me. It is a foundational pillar of my daily sanity. I still train 5 to 6 days a week with that same driving, protective intensity, because the broken 19-year-old kid inside me still believes that staying big and staying strong is the only way to keep the world from trapping him in the dark ever again. Chapter 14. The Silent Diagnosis. The physical body possesses an unyielding memory, and it completely refuses to pretend that everything is fine just because you have stepped off the boat and onto dry land. During that ashore-off cycle, the excruciating pain and the chronic internal bleeding didn't stop. They mutated into a persistent, everyday nightmare that standard-issue Navy Motrin could no longer camouflage. Every single trip to the bathroom became a grueling exercise in physical agony, a sharp bleeding reminder of the submarine head that left me sweating and shaking. Eventually, the sheer severity of the symptoms forced me out of my defensive shell and directly into the military naval medical system. The doctors scheduled me for a colonoscopy to map out the internal damage. The day of the procedure, I found myself sitting in a sterile, fluorescent-lit medical room, stripped of my uniform and wrapped in a hospital gown. Sitting right next to my bed, holding my hand, was my wife. Having her there was a comfort, but it was also a terrifying psychological anchor. The medical team completed the scope, and when the sedation began to clear, the lead doctor walked back into the room to deliver the findings. He explained that they had discovered significant, raw internal inflammation and a distinct layer of physical scarring inside my colon. Now, had I possessed the courage to tell them the truth about what had actually happened to me in the lower flats of that ship, the data would have made perfect, instantaneous sense to them. They would have known exactly what caused that tissue to tear and scar. But the shame was a physical brick choking my throat. When they asked if I had any idea what could have triggered this level of internal trauma, I just looked away blankly. "I don't know," I whispered. "I don't know what's going on." Because I couldn't give them the real baseline data, the doctors did what the military medical system always does. They stamped a clinical label on the symptoms, wrote down an official diagnosis of colitis, handed me a regimen of medications to help repair the localized damage, and moved right on to the next chart. Over the next few weeks, the treatment did its job. The physical bleeding eventually tapered off, and the searing pain finally stopped. For that, I was profoundly thankful. But the physical relief didn't erase the memory of the look on that doctor's face. I still remember the awkward, heavy expression in his eyes as he looked at my chart, then looked at me, and then looked over at my wife sitting by the bedside. I think he knew, deep down in his medical instincts, that something was profoundly wrong with the narrative I was giving him. He knew the scarring didn't fit the standard profile of a regular 20-year-old kid dealing with a digestive flare-up. But he didn't know how to ask the question, especially not with my wife sitting right there in the room, watching his every move. As I sat on that examination table, I was looking at him with a desperate, silent pleading. I didn't want to say the words myself. I didn't want to be the first person to blurt out the horror of the assault in front of my family. I was completely paralyzed by the terror of the fallout. But inside my own head, I was screaming for a lifeline. I desperately wanted that doctor to just take the initiative, step into the gap, and ask me the direct question. STS-3, did someone do this to you? It sounds strange to explain to someone who hasn't survived a violation, but I genuinely believe that if that doctor had just found the words to ask me explicitly, I would have broken. I would have dropped the armor, let the tears flow, and handed him the truth right then and there. I wanted to be caught. I wanted the system to see through my mask so the burden of carrying the secret would be ripped out of my hands. But the question never came. The doctor stayed professional. The unasked truth hung heavily in the air between us, and the door clicked shut. I walked out of that clinic with a bottle of colitis medication in my pocket and the terrifying realization that if I was going to survive the Midwatch shadow, I was going to have to keep fighting the war in total, absolute silence. Chapter 15, The Empty Shell. We were working inside the squadron offices during our ashore off cycle, navigating the standard mountain of administrative paperwork that comes with submarine life. I was sitting at a desk when a familiar voice cut through the hum of the computers. It was MM2 Miller. He was moving through the office spaces, casually saying goodbye to the other machinists' mates and engineering staff as he officially processed his transfer orders out of the fleet and onto shore duty. I sat completely paralyzed, my hands locking onto the edges of my desk, listening to the casual laughter of the men as they wished him luck. I had spent months praying for this exact moment. I genuinely believed that the second his boots cleared the command gate, a massive, instantaneous surge of relief would flood my chest. I thought the weight would lift. But as the outer glass door clicked shut and his footsteps faded down the concrete corridor, absolutely nothing changed. The relief never came. A devastating, icy truth settled into my stomach. I was still a hollow shell of the person I used to be, and him walking away wasn't going to change a single second of what had already occurred in those shower stalls. The monster was gone from the ship, but he had successfully left his phantom permanently locked inside my head. The deployment that followed was much the same. Mechanically, the boat was safer because he was gone, and my anxiety dialed down just enough for me to focus entirely on my watch rotations. But trauma rewrites your biological programming for good. Even with Miller off the crew list, I still could not bring myself to use that crew shower ever again. The psychological block was absolute. Instead, I leaned entirely into the dry hygiene survival strategy I had engineered. Before every single run, I made sure I packed a massive, calculated cache of baby wipes, dry shampoo, and disposable waterless toothbrushes. It sounds completely gross to a civilian reader, but the reality of military survival forces you to adapt. To be completely fair to myself, I did a damn good job. I took meticulous care of my personal hygiene and appearance, ensuring I stayed crisp and professional through every grueling month at sea without ever letting my guard down long enough to turn on a single shower faucet beneath the waves. By the time I was out on my 4th deployment, 2 full runs after the rape, the structural cracks in my personal life began to manifest through the ship's text-only family emails. While underwater on a strategic patrol, your connection to the surface is stripped down to bare, sparse lines of text. Halfway through that run, the incoming messages from my wife began to take on a deeply concerning, heavy quality. It felt like she was constantly pouring her heart out about how intensely unhappy, discouraged, and completely wrong everything felt in her world. Trapped in the insular vacuum of the sonar shack, running on pure survival mode, I completely misread the data. I assumed she was simply going through a temporary phase of standard civilian depression. I didn't have the emotional bandwidth to see the true origin of her pain. I wouldn't know the reality of the wreckage until the deployment finally ended, and I stepped back into our home. Once we got back from that 4th deployment, during the quiet off-season ashore, the cold distance in our house became unbearable. Then came a night where something completely primal and unyielding compelled me to pick up her phone. Things were entirely off, and I knew it. I slid through the screens, my eyes scanning the text logs, until a specific sentence leaped off the glass and burned itself into my memory. To this very day, those words are stuck in the parameters of my mind. That awkward moment when the guy that you did stuff with walks in. The world collapsed into absolute silence. My wife was cheating on me, and the betrayal was born directly from the dark ecosystem of the submarine base. She was sleeping with a sailor from the alternate crew, the Gold Crew. The architecture of the affair was a cruel, seamless puzzle optimized around the military schedule. When I was out at sea on the Blue Crew, trapped in the dark trying to survive the ghosts of my own mind, he was ashore, taking my spot in my house and my bed. When I returned from deployment, he would slide out to sea on the Gold Crew rotation. And as the truth unraveled, I discovered that even during the small, frantic periods where our crew schedules overlapped in port, she would still find deceptive ways to slip away and see him. Discovering that text was one of the hardest, most gut-wrenching things I have ever had to deal with in my life. The betrayal slammed into my chest with an absolute blinding rage. I remember violently throwing her phone across the room onto the mattress, the walls of our bedroom shaking as the confrontation erupted. First, she did what anyone caught in a corner does. She lied. She minimized the timeline, claiming it was far less significant than it actually was, trying to smooth over the immediate blast radius. But she didn't realize who she was dealing with. I approached the investigation of her infidelity with the exact same frantic, unyielding velocity and mechanical precision that I had used to map out Miller's watch schedules and internal ship routines. I turned into a ruthless counterintelligence operator inside my own house. I spent days obsessively ripping through old Sprint phone bills, tracing timestamps, cross-referencing deployment logs, and digging through every hidden message and digital trail I could find. I interrogated friends, I questioned family, and I tracked the data relentlessly until I finally unmasked the exact identity of the Gold Crew sailor. I intentionally choose not to put that person's name on these pages. It wouldn't be fair, and from the vantage point of the man I am today, I refuse to place the full, definitive blame entirely on them. Yeah, what they did was fundamentally wrong. It was a devastating violation of vows that tore my remaining sanctuary to absolute pieces. But when I look honestly into the mirror of that wreckage today, I recognize that I was definitely a massive part of the problem. I wasn't there. I wasn't providing. For years, I had been nothing but a hollow, frozen shell of a human being going through the mechanical motions of life, completely unable to give her the emotionally present, loving husband she genuinely deserved. Hiding the trauma of the rape had turned me into a stranger who lived behind an unbridgeable wall of video games, poker tables, and physical fitness. I had starved our relationship of true presence, and the empty space I left behind was a vacuum that another man eventually stepped into. It is a brutal, agonizing truth to swallow. And unfortunately, it took the total separation and collapse of my marriage for me to fully realize how deeply the submarine had hollowed out my soul. Chapter 16. The Flashpoint. When I finally unraveled the baseline data of the infidelity, the calendar gave me a brutal hand to play. The Gold Crew was currently out at sea on strategic patrol, and my crew, the Blue Crew, was locked in port. This meant I had months to sit in the quiet spaces of our house, letting the reality of the betrayal simmer in my chest. I knew deep down that I wasn't being told the full truth. The human mind can sense when a narrative is missing its core pieces, and filling in those blanks became my absolute, unyielding obsession. During the daylight hours, I fought like hell to make the marriage work. I tried to look past the shadows. I consciously forced myself to be more loving, more present, and more caring than I had been in years. At times, the old connection flared back to life, and I thought we might actually survive the blast radius. But then the night watches ashore would arrive. At midnight, when the house went dark, I would creep into the spare bedroom, click on a dim lamp, and spend hours meticulously mapping out every single timestamp, number, and text sequence from the printed Sprint phone bills. I was running a parallel investigation in the dark, waiting for the ocean to bring the Gold Crew back to the pier. I couldn't carry the weight of the secret by myself anymore. I eventually broke down and told a few of my closest, most trusted friends in the sonar division exactly what had happened. Looking back from the perspective of a mature man, those guys probably should have stopped me. They should have put a hand on my shoulder and locked me in a room until the rage passed. But we weren't mature men. We were a pack of young sailors in our early 20s, fueled by intense tribal loyalty, and I was a deeply hurt, hyper-vigilant individual who had finally found a tangible target for all the suppressed anger I'd been forced to swallow since my first deployment. The day the Gold Crew finally crossed the brow and returned the ship to our custody, the countdown hit 0. I didn't hesitate. I used my network on the boat to trace his schedule, finding out exactly which watch station he was currently manning down in the lower compartments. I descended the ladders, my blood boiling inside me, the red light of the passageways blurring into a clean, singular line of focus. I walked into the space, confronted him face to face, and let the pressure valve explode. I violently shoved him back into a metal desk and landed a hard punch across his face before the surrounding watchstanders realized what was happening and forcefully dragged me off of him. The second the adrenaline cleared and my boots were planted back on the deck plates, an icy wave of pure terror hit my stomach. I knew the uniform code of military justice. I had just physically assaulted a fellow sailor while he was actively standing an official watch on a nuclear warship. In the United States Navy, that isn't a minor disciplinary infraction. It is a fast track to a court-martial, a reduction in rank, and a definitive sentence inside a military brig. I believed my career, my rank as an STS-3, and my future were completely finished. A short time later, I was marched directly into the office of our weapons officer. The room was heavy with institutional tension. The weapons officer looked across his desk at me, his face unreadable, and asked a single direct question. "Petty officer, what the hell is going on with you?" I looked him in the eye, dropped the armor, and told him the absolute, unvarnished truth. I didn't hide behind a narrative. I laid out the entirety of my wife's infidelity, the logistics of the Gold Crew rotation, and the reality of what I had discovered on the phone bills. To my absolute amazement, the bureaucratic hammer never fell. The Navy is an incredibly tight-knit, insular group of people, and up until that exact afternoon, I had spent years earning the deep professional respect of every senior leader around me. I was a top-tier sonar tech, a qualified sonar auxiliary operator, and a sailor who executed his duties with mechanical perfection. The command looked at the situation, weighed my record against the violation, and quietly made a decision to protect one of their own. They brushed the entire assault under the table, processing the paperwork like it had never occurred in the ship's logs. A few weeks after the flashpoint, the raw, white-hot rage finally began to cool into a dull, manageable ache. That was when the most unexpected turn of the deployment took place. The Gold Crew sailor and I actually sat down in a quiet space ashore and had a series of real, unfiltered conversations. Looking back, I recognized that it took an immense amount of pure guts for him to look me in the eye after the punch, and for that, I developed a strange, quiet respect for him. The conversations didn't happen easily. I honestly had to beg him for the details. The unresolved questions were actively keeping me awake at night, circling my brain like a shark. In a way, I think my mind was latching onto the mechanics of the affair as a massive, subconscious distraction, a way to focus on a civilian betrayal so I wouldn't have to look at the deeper, terrifying trauma that MM2 Miller had left behind in my soul. He finally relented. He unlocked his phone and pulled up a sequence of text messages my wife had sent him while I was out at sea. I stood there in the quiet room, reading the words on the screen. The texts were incredibly, graphically sexual, written with a raw, uninhibited desire that was completely unlike anything I had ever received from her in our entire relationship. Seeing those words on the glass was the definitive execution order for our marriage. A clean, tragic clarity settled over my chest. I finally realized that the damage wasn't just a crack we could patch over with more care and better dates. The foundation was entirely gone. I wasn't going to be able to push this under far enough to ever get past it. The trust was dead, and the chasm was too wide to bridge. The timeline for our next deployment was accelerating, and I refused to sail back down into the dark, carrying the weight of a dying marriage on my back. Right before the Blue Crew prepared to take the ship out for my 5th deployment, I sat her down in our living room. "I want a divorce," I told her flatly. "It's over. You need to pack your things and go back home." She didn't fight the verdict. She packed up the life we had spent years trying to build in Washington, cleared her things out of our house, and caught a flight back to Michigan. As I watched her drive away, I was left standing entirely alone in an empty house, surrounded by bare walls and packed boxes. I had successfully cleared the deck of my personal life, but as the deployment date rushed toward me, I had to face the terrifying reality that I was about to slide back under the waves for the solo run of my career, stripped of my sanctuary, stripped of my marriage, with absolutely nothing left to protect me but the iron hull beneath my boots. Chapter 17, Cruise Control and the Long Drive Home. Before I pulled out of the harbor for my second-to-last deployment, the Navy handed me one final institutional milestone. I was officially promoted to second-class petty officer, an STS-2. Walking onto the boat with 2 chevrons on my sleeve brought a brief flash of pride, but the emotional weight of the rank was vastly different this time around. Becoming a second class didn't change my trajectory. I had absolutely no interest in continuing a career with the Navy. My mind was completely made up, and my eyes were locked on the exit gate. To me, the promotion didn't mean a future. It simply meant more money in my paycheck to help stabilize the fallout of my collapsing personal life. Yet, as odd as it might sound to an outsider, a strange, quiet weight lifted off my shoulders the moment my wife drove away. I was suddenly single, and while the trauma of the assaults had undoubtedly driven a massive wedge between us, the mature clarity of hindsight reveals a simpler truth. We had just gotten married far too young. People undergo massive, radical transformations between the ages of 19 and 22. You change your worldview, your goals, and your identity so rapidly in those years that it is incredibly difficult to stay on the same page. We had drifted apart long before the infidelity unraveled. In a clinical, detached way, the betrayal simply acted as the final, definitive excuse that gave me a practical reason to end a marriage that was already hollowed out. With the house empty and MM2 Miller long gone from the fleet, my internal security system allowed my guard to drop just a fraction. But it never dropped fully. The worry, the anger, and the deep-seated trauma of what had been done to me inside those steel walls were still vibrating beneath the surface. I didn't know how to process them, and I didn't have anyone to talk to. So I did what I had watched the men in my family do my entire life. I buried it. I packed the horror down into a dark, locked box in my subconscious and focused entirely on the day-to-day routine of the ship. During those quiet hours staring at the sonar screens, my mind would frequently drift away from the Pacific and travel all the way back to Michigan, settling on my relationship with my father. Growing up, my dad was never a man who showed a lot of emotion. He was a stoic figure, and to be completely honest, we never really got along when I was a kid. I wasn't a great student in high school, my grades were subpar, and I was always a bit of a troublemaker, constantly getting into minor scrapes and drifting without a clear direction. I think he looked at me back then and worried I was going to waste my life. That narrative shifted the exact day I swore my oath and joined the Navy. The moment I stepped into uniform, I finally earned his respect. He understood the sacrifice of the service, and seeing me endure the harsh reality of the submarine fleet built a bridge between us that had never existed before. From that point forward, our relationship has gotten nothing but better and better as time has gone on. Today, watching him step into the role of a great-grandfather to my children is something I wouldn't trade for anything on earth. I would easily choose to have him be a little absent or tough during my own childhood if it meant ensuring he would turn into the incredible, loving grandfather he is to my kids today. That realization brought a sense of peace to my identity. I had proven my grit to the man whose respect I wanted most, and that gave me a solid foundation to carry through the dark. Because of that internal closure, my final 2 deployments dissolved into a bit of a blur. Knowing with absolute certainty that I was getting out of the service, I checked out of the Navy's academic culture entirely. I didn't spend a single second of my off-watch time fighting for advanced qualifications or extra technical certifications. Instead, I set up my final watch rotations to run on pure, unadulterated cruise control. By that point in my career, I had earned seniority within the division, which came with a massive quality of life upgrade, my own permanent berthing rack. I no longer had to worry about sharing space. Taking full advantage of the privacy, I successfully smuggled a full Xbox console down the hatches and into my bunk. The setup was a minor masterpiece of submarine engineering. I found a small, empty mechanical cubbyhole right at the foot of my rack where the console fit perfectly. I then bought a small flat-screen television and meticulously velcroed it directly to the metal overhead panel of my bunk structure. My routine for those final months at sea became beautifully simplified and mechanical. I stood my watches with flawless professionalism. I hit the missile compartment flats to lift heavy weights and focus entirely on my body, and the second I was off duty, I slid into my rack, pulled the curtain shut, turned on my Xbox, and lost myself in digital worlds. The hours flew by at maximum speed. When the Alabama finally returned to port for my 5th and final deployment, A sudden, sharp surge of bureaucratic anxiety hijacked my relief. My official military contract was scheduled to hit its end-of-service date in January of 2014. However, due to the rolling nature of the Navy's crew schedules, the Blue Crew was slated to slide back under the waves for another strategic patrol right around that exact same window. I was absolutely terrified that the command was going to freeze my paperwork and extend my contract just to keep a qualified STS-2 body on the watch bill for one more run. The thought of descending down that trunk line again made my stomach turn. I didn't want a single extra day. I just wanted my time, my discharge papers, and my freedom. Fortunately, the numbers broke in my favor. I had saved up a massive cache of 60 days of terminal leave, allowing me to accelerate my departure from the base. My official exit date was moved up to October of 2013. The final morning in Washington, the rainy skies of the Pacific Northwest felt entirely different. My mom flew out from Michigan, landing at the airport with a rental car and a mission to bring her son home. We packed up the last of my civilian clothes, loaded my military sea bags into the trunk, and drove through the main security gates of Naval Base Kitsap, Bangor for the very last time. As the guard shack disappeared in the rearview mirror and the highway opened up toward the east, one of the greatest, most profound sensations of relief I have ever known washed over my entire body. It felt like a massive physical stone was being lifted off my shoulder blades. The iron hull, the chemical scent of amine, the toxic leverage of the qualification cards, and the terrifying shadow of MM2 Miller were permanently trapped behind the mountain lines of Washington. I was 22 years old, my uniform was packed away in the dark, and as my mom and I pointed the car toward the Michigan state line, I let out a long, shaky breath, ready to figure out who Steven Bellinger was supposed to be in the light. Chapter 18. The Delayed Echo. For more than 10 years, I genuinely believed I had won the war against my own history. When I drove away from the naval base in October 2013, I locked the memories of the USS Alabama inside an absolute iron vault in the deepest recesses of my subconscious mind. I packed the trauma down so far beneath the surface that day-to-day life felt completely normal. I didn't think about Miller. I didn't think about the shower stalls. I built a life back home in Michigan, stayed fiercely dedicated to my physical fitness, and convinced myself that the ghost had no hold on me. I assumed that if you bury a monster deep enough, it eventually suffocates in the dark. I was completely wrong. Trauma doesn't suffocate, it just waits for a crack in the door. The vault held until roughly 2021. It was a completely ordinary day, and I was sitting at home, scrolling through a casual group chat on my phone with a handful of old Navy friends. We were reminiscing about our tour, swapping old fleet jokes, when someone casually typed his name into the chat. Just seeing those characters on a glass screen changed my life forever. I had no idea that a simple name could possess that kind of devastating, reality-shattering power. In a fraction of a second, the iron vault I had spent a decade building was completely vaporized. My mind began wreaking absolute havoc on itself, unearthing every single sight, sound, smell, and suffocating feeling I had spent 10 years trying to outrun. The timeline collapsed. I wasn't a veteran safe at home in Michigan anymore. I was instantly thrown back into a violent, downward psychological spiral, completely paralyzed by the return of the shadow. The bill for a decade of silence had finally come due, and it was taking an unbearable toll on my mind. Since that afternoon, life has been tough in a way I was completely unprepared for. Before that chat, I didn't know what true anxiety was. I had never experienced a real panic attack in my life. I had felt little bits and pieces of stress during my deployment, sure, but nothing could have prepared my nervous system for the absolute terror of a full-body panic response. I remember my very first panic attack like it happened 5 minutes ago. I was just leaving the gym with my wife, walking out to the truck into the fresh air. The people who have lived through what I am talking about will know exactly what I mean. If you have never experienced a true panic attack, It is almost impossible to put the sheer horror of it into human words. The only way I can think to describe it is that your heart rate instantly explodes, redlining so violently that you can physically feel it beating straight out of your chest. Simultaneously, a sudden suffocating tightening grips your throat. It feels exactly like when you swallow a piece of food without chewing it up all the way, that heavy, terrifying lump that feels completely stuck in your windpipe, cutting off your air. Only the feeling never passes. It is constant. At the time, I was entirely convinced I was having a massive, fatal heart attack. The terror was so visceral that I ended up going to the emergency room multiple times in a state of total desperation, only for the doctors to run the EKGs, look at the monitors, and say, "Hey man, your heart is fine. This is just anxiety. You're having a panic attack. It's completely normal." Everyone in the medical world tells you it's normal, but when you are trapped inside it, it doesn't feel normal. It feels like you are actively dying on the floor. I have been battling that internal warfare ever since, moving in and out of the clinical system, trying to learn how to live with a brain that treats the regular world like a combat zone. In the midst of that struggle, I have to give a massive, heartfelt shout out to the VA. For all the bureaucratic complaints people have about the system, the VA has stepped up and truly taken care of me as a veteran. I didn't even know I was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder until I finally forced myself to sit down in a room, talk to a professional, and let them know what was actually going on inside my head. I am still in therapy today, sitting in the chairs every week, fighting to reclaim the spaces the trauma stole from me. I am currently deep in the middle of exposure therapy, a grueling, painful process of intentionally facing the memories so they lose their power over my body. It is the hardest training I have ever done, but I am pushing through the static with the hope that I can finally start to feel true freedom soon. I am putting my full story onto these pages because I want this book to serve as an absolute lifeline for someone else out there who is currently trapped in the dark. If something has happened to you, or if you are in trouble right now, please understand that burying it is only a temporary fix. It is just a matter of time before the echo catches up to the silence. And when it does, it is completely okay to ask for help. If you aren't comfortable telling the people in your immediate circle, I understand that better than anyone. Hell, up until this very moment, I haven't told a single soul in my personal life my full story. The only entity that knows the absolute truth of what happened to me inside that submarine is the VA medical staff. My own wife doesn't even know the details on these pages yet. I made a definitive promise to myself that I am going to sit down and tell her the full story for the very first time before this book ever comes out. She is going to be the first person to read these chapters. I am breaking my own silence to save my own life. Please, if you are hurting, just get help. Life is far too short to spend your remaining years on Earth carrying that massive, suffocating type of weight on your back. In our culture, this specific type of trauma doesn't happen as openly to men as it does to women, and because of that, male survivors carry a double layer of isolation and shame. But if there is a man out there reading this, even if you weren't assaulted the way I was, even if you are just drowning beneath the pressure of your own mind or going through a crappy situation you don't know how to fix, reach out. Put down the armor. There are people out there who genuinely want to help you. There are people who can help you, even when you feel completely broken and helpless. You don't have to live your life as an empty shell. You deserve to breathe. You deserve to be present for the people who love you, and you deserve to finally cross the brow into the light. Epilogue: Finding the Surface. There is a distinct kind of magic in the quiet, steady rhythm of regular life on solid ground. When you spend years thousands of feet beneath the ocean inside a multi-billion-dollar weapon system, you forget what the earth feels like. You forget the simple luxury of a morning breeze, the changing of the seasons, and the absolute freedom of a horizon that doesn't end in a steel bulkhead. Today, my life unfolds in Michigan, far away from the Pacific Northwest and light years away from the red-lit watch stations of the USS Alabama. The empty shell I carried home with me in 2013 is no longer empty. It is actively, steadily filling back up with real, vibrant life. Healing from complex trauma isn't a straight line, and it doesn't happen overnight. I still go to therapy, and I still do the heavy, exhausting work of exposure treatment to untangle the knots MM2 Miller left in my nervous system. But the massive, suffocating weight that used to redline my heart at 200 beats per minute has lost its absolute grip. I am learning how to just breathe. The coping mechanisms I built out of pure survival have transformed into the pillars of my daily existence, but the architecture beneath them is far more complex than a simple recovery story. The anchors of the present. I still go to the gym 5 to 6 days a week, but if I am being completely honest with myself and the reader, the psychological engine driving that iron hasn't magically changed. All the therapists, online psychology papers, and clinical experts can say whatever they want. They can look at my charts and tell me that my behavior is irrational. I know intellectually that their data is factual. I know that putting on muscle doesn't rewrite the past. But there is a deep, illogical fear locked inside my nervous system that I have never been able to completely shake. The unyielding belief that if I had just been bigger, broader, and stronger back then, the violation would have never happened to me. To this very day, that is the exact reason I work out as hard as I do. My mind remains convinced that if I appear physically imposing to the outside world, I can guarantee my own safety, that no one will ever look at my frame and see a target again. It is a curse, a phantom echo of the submarine head that forces me to keep my guard up. But by the same token, it has become a strange blessing. Because of what happened to me beneath the waves, I take meticulous, unyielding care of my physical health. It is the ultimate silver lining on a very dark cloud, using the energy of a lifelong curse to keep my body alive, disciplined, and strong. Where I used to hide behind video games, poker tables, and casino trips to outrun the ghosts in my head, I now use my passions to genuinely connect with the world. I find a deep, meditative peace out on the golf course, watching a ball cut through a clear blue sky. I lose myself in the strategy of gaming on my own terms, in the focus of 3D printing, and in the bustling, fast-paced community of collecting and auctioning trading cards. These aren't survival distractions anymore. They are genuine pieces of a full, joyful life. They are proof that a mind once locked in a tactical cat-and-mouse game can find happiness in the quiet, normal things. The price of leadership. That driving protective instinct didn't just stay confined to the gym floor. It entirely dictated the trajectory of my professional career ashore. But the honest truth is, the civilian world has not been a clean, straightforward victory lap. For the last 10 years, my professional life has been a turbulent, exhausting game of tug-of-war against my own history. I have burned through 6 or 7 different jobs over the past decade. A constant, frantic cycle of building momentum only for the internal static to derail the track just as I was hitting my stride. My work ethic and raw grit have pushed me as far as a sales manager, a position where I finally possess the leverage to run my own play and protect my team. But I have never been able to push past that glass ceiling. Every single time I get close to the next level of advancement, the ghost rears its head. The wreckage of the Alabama left a permanent, distorted blueprint in my mind for how I perceive authority. Deep down, in the unhealed corners of my brain, I still subconsciously view leaders as people who hurt people. Because of that survival programming, navigating relationships with upper management has been a fierce, invisible warfare. The moment a corporate executive steps into my space to exert control, my nervous system doesn't see a boss, it sees a threat. It immediately zeroes in on the power dynamic, treating the corporate ladder exactly like a locked compartment in the lower flats of a submarine. Because I was left completely unprotected in the dark as a 20-year-old kid, I always wanted to put myself in a position where I was the one making the decisions, explicitly so I could build a wall of protection around the little people who just get constantly shit on by the system, Unfortunately, in corporate America, that type of true protective leadership is a highly dangerous trait. Modern corporate culture doesn't actually want leaders. It wants a seamless, unquestioning line of yes men who value profit margins over human dignity. When you are a survivor who knows exactly what it feels like to be completely powerless, you flat out refuse to nod your head and play along with the script. You speak back. You stand up for the people on the floor. And eventually, that refusal to bow down, and my identity as a wounded veteran, made me a primary target. Back in November, my career at a prominent, multi-million-dollar automotive group in Michigan came to a sudden, crashing halt. They fired me for being a veteran with PTSD who had the absolute audacity to reach out for help. Let's be completely, uncomfortably clear about what happened. They weaponized my mandatory VA medical appointments against me. They took the time I required to heal the invisible wounds I carried home from the deep, and they used it as a corporate termination slip. It wasn't about capability, it wasn't about performance, and it wasn't about standard scheduling conflicts. It was the calculated targeting of a disabled veteran whose psychological recovery became too inconvenient for a machine that only cares about moving inventory. They punished me for seeking the help that keeps me alive. They wanted a hollow employee who would look the other way, but I refused to compromise my morals for a corporate puppet master. I can still remember a specific event around Halloween that completely encapsulates the moral rot I was actively fighting against inside that company. The managers put out an incentive, offering financial rewards to employees who were willing to skip trick-or-treating with their young children just to stay on the lot and sell cars. To me, that behavior is fundamentally, morally reprehensible and disgusting. I refuse to see how any executive can look at a parent's fleeting, irreplaceable years with their kids and view it as nothing more than an obstacle to a monthly sales quota. I might be completely alone in that evaluation, but I don't care. That event represents exactly why corporate America is fracturing from the inside out. We don't need more hollow yes men protecting corporate silos. We desperately need true leaders who remember what it means to be human, who protect their people, and who refuse to let a business grind human lives into dust. I walked out their doors with my integrity completely intact. They wanted me to choose between my mental health as a veteran and their bottom line, and I will choose my survival, my integrity, and my family every single time. Crossing the brow. The absolute greatest victory of my recovery is standing right in front of me every single day. My kids. For years, the shadow of the submarine made me a stranger to the people who loved me. Today, I am entirely, completely present for my children. I get to be the father they genuinely deserve, not a hollow shell going through the mechanical motions of life, but a dad who laughs, who listens, and who watches them grow with an unshakable sense of pride. I refuse to sacrifice a single second of their childhood for a corporate bonus check. To make the circle complete, I get to witness my own father step into their lives. The stoic, silent man I struggled to connect with as a troubled teenager has transformed into an incredible, deeply loving grandfather. Watching him play with my kids, seeing the joy and the mutual respect that now defines our family, is a gift I wouldn't trade for anything on the face of the earth. The generational silence has been broken, and the bridge we built the day I joined the Navy has held strong. Life is incredibly short, and it is far too beautiful to spend it drowning beneath a weight you were never meant to carry alone. If you had told the terrified junior sailor sitting on the floor of that steaming shower stall that one day he would put his story into a book, break his silence, and stand tall in the light of a normal life, he wouldn't have believed you. He felt too small, too ruined, and too entirely alone. But I am writing these final words to prove that the predator doesn't get the final say. The institution doesn't get to keep your identity. You can survive the freeze. You can survive the breakdown of your sanctuary. And you can survive the long, agonizing drive home into the unknown. I still have watches to stand in my own mind, and the echoes of the deep still pulse every now and then. But I am no longer running. I am in therapy, I am breaking the silence with the woman I love, and I am stepping forward with my head held high. The hatches are open, the air is clean, and for the first time in my life, Steven Bellinger is finally home, completely free and standing firmly on the surface.